All right, hello everybody. Let's get this started. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and you are joining us for another edition of Committee for Sydney Live. Today we will be featuring Tim Reardon, Secretary of the New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet, to talk about the state of the state after COVID-19. Tim Reardon will be known to most of you who are involved with the committee. He has been Secretary of DPC since 2017. He has led on delivering many of the things that we care about most, that the people of New South Wales care about most: customer service, digital transformation, infrastructure delivery, transformation of the public service, and of course, everything else. Prior to joining DPC, Tim was Secretary of Transport, where he led one of the biggest changes, one of the biggest expansions of transport infrastructure and services in a generation. It is a real honor to have him join us today, taking time out of his schedule. Those of you who have done this know how it works. He will make some opening remarks, and then we'll have time for questions and answers, which you can submit via the Q&A app on Zoom. Secretary, thank you very much. Over to you.
Gabriel, thank you very much, and it's good to see you. And it's been a little while because of COVID-19, and I can't thank the Committee for Sydney enough for your advocacy throughout this period. Your voice has been heard, and it's been wonderful to have that continuity, even though you've had to put it onto a digital platform. Your innovation in doing this is fantastic, so to be applauded. And I'm very happy to be back within the family, which is the Committee for Sydney, to have a chat today. I have a few opening comments. I'm going to read a few of those comments just to make sure that I cover, and that might give a flavour for questions that come in, if that suits you. First thing I wanted to do was to acknowledge country and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's one of the things we can't forget about during this digital era now, if we're going to tilt to how we deliver services and indeed have these conversations to acknowledge country. It was one of the things I noticed slipped a little bit there for a month or two, and I just want to make sure that I bring it back and discipline myself on that. Without a doubt, it has been an incredible 12-month period. We've had droughts, bushfires, floods, and now COVID-19. None of us would have wanted a year like this, but we've experienced it nonetheless. I think for the state of New South Wales, probably more so than some of the other jurisdictions, because it has been indeed 12 months. In fact, next month will be July, and that will be a 12-month period since the very first of the bushfires were starting to occur in 2019. So quite an incredible period. I think it's underlined for this state something that I've wanted to see grow over a period of time, and that is the skills, capabilities of us in the private sector, the government, and indeed the community, bounded by one word, and that's resilience. And I think as a state, we've really shown that we are a resilient people. I think we have skills and capabilities and a culture now that can pretty much stand up and respond to most things that are put in front of us. And we've certainly been doing that. And now we're thinking about how we tilt to the recovery and doing that quite fast. I want to acknowledge the public health response that's been underway for COVID-19 since January. It was about mid-January this year that myself and the Secretary of Health had our very first conversation. I was sitting at this very desk about whether we needed to enact the pandemic plan, which is one of the disaster recovery plans, response and recovery plans we have in the state of New South Wales. We monitored that for a few weeks, and then it was enacted fairly quickly after that. And since that time, public health has been at the forefront of what we've been doing both as a state and certainly nationally, playing our role in guiding the public health response. So health have had to do that. They've had to communicate and message to the community across all of those basic hygiene factors that we all know too well now: social distancing, good hygiene for ourselves, and making sure if we show any signs or symptoms ourselves that we get tested and do it rapidly, and not coming to work or indeed anywhere else if we do feel unwell. Health have also had to put the ICU response into the public health, into the public hospitals across the state. and they've done that in a rapid pace. We've had to tilt with our service delivery across education, across public transport, across the energy sector, and across construction, and all those essential services. I'm very happy to report of, remain engaged and delivered throughout this period. Very differently in some places, and I'll talk about a few of those, but their essential nature has only come further to the fore, and it's been a source of pride for the public service to actually do that during this period. We've also brought thousands of Australians back home safely from overseas and continue to do so almost on a daily basis at the moment. And most of those people have come through Sydney because we are the global city of this nation. I think the pandemic has only redoubled that focus that we are the global part of Australia. And the fact that we've brought multiple thousands of people back safely, not really reported on a lot, has been a hallmark of how we've done this and done it safely. I think the world has seen us deal with things in a pragmatic and practical way. I think they've seen how we respond to crises, plural. And now we're about resetting our economy, and quite literally, we have to reset our way of life and get back to rebuilding the society, the parts that we love, and locking in some new parts that we've had to learn about. I'd have to say for me, and a call out again to the committee, that it has been Team New South Wales. People have pulled together from government, private sector and the community and done an incredible job. And I would hope that that spirit of collegiality, we bed in even further. We had it reasonably well leading into the last year, but I think it's only increased in its in both importance, but how it means we can work together to make certainly Sydney and New South Wales a better place to live, work and visit. So I sincerely thank people for that spirit of collegiality. I'll spend a few moments just on the economic recovery. Most commentators call it a new normal. I'm sure we've reached the peak of using the term new normal, but someone can market a new statement soon. But it is a new normal, and by necessity, I think that is very true. For the economy of New South Wales, some industries have actually powered on during this period. Clearly, digital and ICT have done very well out of it, as per what we're communicating on right now. The healthcare sector, by necessity, have done well, as is some parts of the aged care sector. Other areas have just gotten on with their work, and we can never take them for granted, like the construction sector. It is so important to the state of New South Wales and the jobs creation in this state, and will continue to be so. The fact that there was no downing of tools like some other jurisdictions around the world, nor even a question that we would down tools, even though we were asked a few times by the infrastructure community, our response out of government and certainly out of public service was to power on and to do it strongly. Work out ways of doing it through the COVID period and being COVID safe, but to get on with our jobs and to give confidence to the market. Other areas that we know have been impacted, and being a services economy has been difficult for us. Retail, accommodation, hospitality and tourism and arts and culture have all been heavily impacted. Quite literally hundreds of thousands of jobs either stood down or lost in a short period of time. For me personally, having watched the economy grow here strongly for a decade has hurt, but it's now time to pause, understand those impacts and try and turn things around. I won't repeat all of the easing of restrictions that are now occurring to try and get those very sectors back up and running as fast as possible. But for those that won't have the V-shaped economic bounce back, and they may be longer in a U-shape or indeed an L-shape, to quote the economists, we will have to spend a fair bit of our time in working in those areas. This state has certainly put a fair bit of economic response in, so we've put about $13 billion of supports in, and combined with the Commonwealth JobKeeper program and Job Seeker program, that has meant that we'll see a lot more people return to their jobs probably faster. That's certainly faster than if we didn't have those supports in place. And they've been really tailored and focused into small business areas where we know hospitality, cafes, pubs and clubs have been severely impacted, and try and get as many people, tens of thousands of people back into their jobs as quickly as possible, which has actually just occurred over the last couple of weeks with the reopening of some of those businesses across the state. But with all that in mind, I think the big opportunities for us going forward now will be about how to have new ways of working in some of those areas. But first and foremost, the public infrastructure pipeline, which I note is top of the pops in your list, Gabrielle, for Committee for Sydney, is to redouble our efforts there. It's now reached the magic mark of $100 billion infrastructure program over the forward estimates, which for those of us who have been involved for a fair few years, that is an incredible hallmark of the New South Wales Government and the New South Wales economy. That is both large projects, for example, the Sydney Metro, for the Western Sydney Airport, the North-South line between St Mary's and the airport, has now been announced and fully funded, so we can get on with the enabling infrastructure, we can get on with the investment attraction around the aerotropolis, and really bring those areas such as advanced manufacturing, aerospace and defence and agribusiness around the aerotropolis to the fore. It really is a city deal that keeps on working and keeps on delivering on the promises that it had in it just a few short years ago. So I'm very proud of the fact that that project has been announced just last week. At the other end of the scale, the government has announced $3 billion of additional infrastructure funding. A lot of that will go into various size projects, but a sweet spot is those smaller projects where there's a lot of shovel-ready work to be done, as we did off the back of bushfires with a $1 billion package. This $3 billion will be going towards a lot of projects of various scales, but those that are small and quick to market to, again, create jobs and generate jobs is an obvious one. Construction just is so important for the state because the multiplier effect of jobs is almost 10 to 1, and it's an obvious place where we redouble our efforts. And the Premier would have only made exactly the same comments to you just in the last wee while when she spoke to you. The second is a few areas that I know people are interested in, such as international education. Now, international education in New South Wales has been a hallmark of this state for a long, long time. But if ever there was a time when we can redefine our service offerings, redefine our international connections, redefine those areas of research and development that we are indeed world leading in, now's that time. We're working with all of the New South Wales universities and the Vice Chancellors right at the moment on those very things. And I'm sure we can really tilt and take a positive out of this difficult period right at the moment. And I know that the committee is also on that same page with that. The other areas are arts and culture and travel and tourism. Both will take a while to bounce back, but they will bounce back. They'll be different, but they'll bounce back. It would be remiss of me not to say if the Minister for Tourism was here that we have such a trade deficit when it comes to international tourism versus domestic tourism, that there is a serious pent-up demand to go and see our own backyard for a while and really spend our dollars in our own backyard to fill the breach that's been lost with international travel until it can come back online. So a real opportunity there to redefine our offerings. Lastly, I'll just sort of say, in terms of economic changes in the state of the state, is New South Wales as a service delivery in the government has changed quite a lot as well. Health has a Premier's priority of having a lot of healthcare in the home undertaken. Almost overnight, virtual healthcare in the home has increased at quite a significant rate. We want to lock in those benefits. Similarly, in education, we've just now trained and taught ourselves to train a full generation of young people in the home. Now, we didn't want them all at home or all at school. We want a combination of the two, but it's really brought the digital technology capabilities and the capabilities of the teachers across the state, whether that's at university level all the way through to early childhood. What is the art of the possible with digital technology when you're faced with the circumstances we have? In transport, we've seen a full redefining of the peak periods for AM and PM peak, certainly in Sydney, and it will take a while to settle down. Not everyone can work at home forever with flexible working. Not everyone needs to work in the CBDs of the Western Parkland City, the River City and the Eastern Harbour City. But some will do both, and it will take a while for that to fluctuate and settle. But the transport cluster is working really hard to redefine what is actually the peak period and enjoy peak spreading and ensuring that our transport system can cope over the longer term. Short term, it will have capacity constraints because of COVID safe requirements, but over the longer term, we want to lock in the behavioural benefits of that. And finally, in planning, a bit of an unsung hero during this period. Planning's probably shot forward with a whole range of process redesign, e-planning, digitisation, and just changes to environmental planning policies more rapidly than I've seen in almost a decade. So it's been quite remarkable to watch what they've done and we just want to ensure that we keep those things for the long term. And I'll just close with some observations about not the economy, but about society in general and social cohesion. We've been observing people's behaviour and what they've been doing during this period, both our own workforces, but certainly collaborating with the private sector to understand what's happening there as well. We've also been watching various areas of the economy and society to make sure that no one falls between the cracks, whether they're a school student without digital technology, whether someone who's lost their job, stood down, or permanently removed from a job that's no longer available. We really want to ensure that we do not suffer the same things that we suffered after the early 90s recession, that we make sure we learn the lessons from those periods about crime rates, domestic violence, and ensuring that mental health is dealt with a lot more effectively than it probably was 30 years ago. Government's put a lot of time and effort and budget into mental health as a package. There's quite a significant package out of the New South Wales Government on mental health. And one of the things, ironically, to come out of this period is mental health. Our mental fitness has become a much more open, transparent and frank conversation across the community. And that's a striking feature of what's occurred. The conversations are far more open and frank about our mental health, and that means all of us. The customer sentiment in that area, early on in the pandemic, as you can imagine, and the threat of pandemic was all about public health and the risks to our health. That switched within a very short period of time to being fully about, in the top 5, being all about economic recovery, debt retirement, job loss. So the tilt in the entire community, 8 million of us, has been about public health. Seemingly we've done fairly well there, but we will have to remain very, very vigilant about a second wave. But it is now all about economic recovery and what we need to do collectively. So what we did about our public health response, we now need to stay very focused on our economic recovery response and not forget or leave anyone behind along the way, and making sure we have a better society, a better economy coming out of this. That new normal is not just about new jobs. It's certainly a very, very big part of it. That new normal is about what I've personally experienced, which is a society with a great level of dignity, respect, understanding that we're all in it together and we need to do things together, and decency, just people being decent with each other and showing real goodwill. They're the things we want to bottle coming out of this, and I hope we can actually do so. So there's some opening comments, Gabrielle. I'll hand back to you and answer as many questions as we have time for.
Okay, Tim, thank you so much. And we're going to have a lot of questions, I can tell already. First off, it was interesting to read that New Zealand believes it has essentially eradicated COVID and is now going to remove all restrictions. Do you think there is any chance that could happen for Australia? And how long till it might be safe to have mass gatherings and those kinds of things?
Sure. So at the National Cabinet level, and the agreements out of that forum have been about a suppression strategy. The Australian health professionals, agreed to a suppression strategy, which is, if you can eradicate or eliminate, fantastic. But being a realist in the only global city we all sit in right now, and knowing that there still is a flow of people into this city who are coming from all parts of the world, eradication in a place like New South Wales may be difficult. Places like Western Australia, Northern Territory and Tasmania have certainly gone for more of an elimination to try and open up their borders. There will always be a challenge for them at some later date about when those borders actually reopen. Queensland will be the same. At some stage they'll need to reopen. I often say and remind people that we have had open borders, not just within Australia, with New South Wales, but with the world throughout the pandemic, regardless of the international travel restrictions. A lot of people have come back into this country and returned safely from most parts of the world. Most of our cases now, day by day, are from overseas. The level of community transmission is almost at zero. So in one sense, you're almost at eradication. In another sense, we're always going to be more of an open border than many others. Victoria have a similar view of the world. New Zealand went for a harder lockdown, there's no doubting that. And the re-emergence was always going to be the challenge for countries and states who do go for that very hard lockdown. We just have to have really good processes in place for, I'll sound like a public health official, really good testing, lots of contact tracing, and really good local hotspot responses. Those things came out of National Cabinet, and we take them very, very seriously. The amount of testing that we do on a daily basis is 8,000 to 10,000 daily, and it's quite exceptionally large. And when we do get a hotspot, unfortunately, we're reasonably trained on that in schools or in Bondi Beach at one stage, or in Warragamba, and we go and deal with the hotspot in an effective way, and we're getting better and better at retraining on that. The reason we want to do that is because if we do have an increase in case numbers, we want to deal with it locally and not go backwards with the economy.
Okay, makes sense. Secretary, a lot of us are worried about this idea of the cliff in September when JobKeeper ends, but also some of the other things like the moratorium on trading insolvent, the rental code. Do you have a view about what to do about that problem, if anything?
So I certainly have a view. The view was, as soon as the public health advices were about shutting down certain parts of our economy, was that we needed to start our economic recovery that day, and to really start getting the New South Wales Government thinking about balancing economic recovery with the shutting down of the economy. And that's what we certainly did. Within the New South Wales Public Service, it's made it in the newspaper, so I can tell you we organised ourselves as a senior group, as a subset of the Secretary's Board, called ourselves Project Spring, to give some optimism and hope on the far side of winter, that we would re-emerge and we would have economic supports in place, and we would have a game plan for what life looks like for Q4 of this calendar year. There's no doubt we've got a lot of things in place, but we're all super clear on the economic supports at the Commonwealth level at this stage are going to finish in early October. I think we've still got a lot of work to do, but I'd only repeat, the public infrastructure pipeline for large projects and a lot of small projects, getting as many businesses in our services sector reopened as wide as possible, and then thinking about more fine-tuned supports that we're putting in place. For example, like for international students locally here, putting in fine-grained supports for them are the areas that we'll need to keep working on. I don't think we're finished with that. I don't think we're finished with that at the national level at all, because that will be the sole focus of National Cabinet for the next 6 months or more, one would imagine, around economic recovery. And what will happen in September and October, I can imagine will fill the agenda from this point forward.
Okay. Secretary, the success of Australia's response in managing the pandemic is really off the charts by global standards. Many people have noticed that may create an opportunity for Australia, may create quite a few opportunities. Just the reputational goodwill of being a safe place in a very deep sense, lower geopolitical risk than many other countries is now the perception. So the opportunity to attract firms, top global talent, or foreign students taking advantage of this global perception is quite extraordinary. That requires strategies to be in place to take advantage of those opportunities to convert. It also requires being able to bring people in, either as immigrants or as students. What are your views on which of those opportunities really make sense and what it would take to pursue them?
Sure. So at strategy level first, during the pandemic, we looked at our economic blueprint that we only just released sort of towards the end of last year. And we also looked at our strategy around our international engagement called Global New South Wales. They're robust strategigies, and they will stand the test of time. Some of the priorities may have changed within them due to the COVID-19, but they are still the focus of our attention. We still want to pursue aerospace and defence. We still want to pursue advanced manufacturing, amongst a whole range of other areas, which I won't fully list here, but they remain the same. The priorities could change opportunistically out of the circumstances that we find ourselves in, without a doubt. But I can only echo what you said. There is a window of opportunity. Our time is upon us now as a nation, and certainly as New South Wales, to take advantage of what we've achieved. We may end up with certain hotspots, etc., and we need to make sure that we're very clear on how we're going to deal with hotspots of COVID-19. But it would be fair to say Australians are practical, pragmatic, as I said, pretty humble, and it's one of those times where we probably just need to rise and say, that worked pretty well for us. Let's take advantage of what it means to have a full COVID-safe economy in this part of the world, and map that to the world absolutely for opportunity. So I think at the macro, we've got strategies in place to actually take advantage of those. I think what we've been doing in the last few months in shoring up parts of the economy, tactically and operationally responding, we just haven't had time to take a little breather to sort of say, okay, where do we chase next at a macro level? We'll do that over the next couple of months, no doubt. But specifically, I think you mentioned international students. I wouldn't mind making the comment to you that you have raised it. Committee for Sydney have raised it and said there's a window of opportunity. You didn't have to tell me twice. There's a massive window of opportunity right now to look at new forms of offerings, new students who, let's face it, would go to places like the United States and United Kingdom and then consider us after that, to look at our offerings right now and put ourselves forward in a far more effectively and Team New South Wales way. And I'm giving the same speech to the Vice-Chancellor, so they've heard it a few times. And they want to do that. They want to work as one across private sector on what best parts of academic and research and development will drive jobs growth, how they can partner with government. So we certainly have strong ambition to have international students back with us in a far larger sense, sooner than probably people wanted. A lot of that means some hard work with the federal government, because it means making sure that where students are coming from are COVID-safe locations as well. So there's a bit to work through there, but very strong will in this jurisdiction to get that moving as quickly as possible.
It would be so extraordinary to have that sector, the foreign student sector, surge back bigger and better than it was before. I mean, it's an export industry that does not generate carbon. Quite wonderful.
Yeah.
Secretary, when can we expect international flights and borders to open?
I think that's above my pay grade, but I think I've made my two comments. One is, for international students, we'd want that to be as soon as practical. But for the foreseeable future, I just see that the return of Australians coming back here, and last count I saw, I think we were up close to 18,000 people who had come back from overseas throughout this pandemic, which so my view is there's been a level of international travel throughout, even though we've had bans. Everyone's talked about the trans-Tasman bubble between ourselves and New Zealand. That'll be a matter of what Prime Minister Reardon and Prime Minister Morrison agree on. You could imagine that will be a first natural place for us. Sorry, my lights have just, I've stood still for too long. Sorry, I'll be 1 sec. Back again. They will work out the timing of that, and they've been talking about that in the media as well. You can imagine after that it will be finding other COVID-safe partners who have certain quarantine and other requirements in place that we find acceptable and they find acceptable. But when that time is, I genuinely do not know. All I know is I think there's an opportunity for international students to prove up what we've been using for quarantine. For all of those thousands of Australian travellers in the last few months, it works well. It's a process that is proven. Bringing international students in and even giving them 14 days of digitised education along the way seems like the obvious next thing to do.
Yes, it does. Secretary, given your remarks about the importance of the construction sector, given a pre-existing problem Sydney was struggling with, which is that housing is very expensive for many households. Do you see any opportunity for a bigger investment in social or affordable housing as part of the recovery program?
I think so, absolutely. It's certainly in the conversation to look at those areas. You know, I noted that there was quite an article on build to rent just yesterday as well. So I think there's a whole range of opportunities. I think that requires sometimes advocacy from very strong voices, including the Committee for Sydney, into government on those some of those areas, on the scale of ambition that we need to achieve, who will actually come forward to build some of the social and affordable housing, and what sort of forms they are. I think it's an area where I think there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of ambition, but the scale of demand versus supply is still mismatched. So yes, absolutely an opportunity. And if now's not the time, when it would have been in terms of bringing that forward.
Secretary, quite a few questions have come in about transport. What we are seeing in cities around the world is a fear of crowding back onto buses and trains, especially in countries that are not having everybody wear masks. However, some cities are experiencing an enormous shift in mode toward cycling. Paris is adding 350 more kilometers of physically separated cycle lanes. For example, London doing something at an equivalent scale, New York, something at an equivalent scale. Thus far, the new infrastructure for cycling in Sydney is just a small taste of what it could be. The committee has recommended that a perfect form of stimulus would be to accelerate the long-term principal bicycle network. It's work that could be done by smaller firms, that could be built relatively quickly. Doing the whole thing would be $5 or $6 billion, but doesn't have to all be done at once. Is there any chance we could see a greater move toward something like that, like we see in other cities? Or if not that, what is the solution to prevent what is being called by some Carmageddon?
Carmageddon gets used about every 5 years for various things.
Doesn't
but,
it?
Yeah. Look, in terms of the public transport network right at the moment, we're socially distanced, so it's pretty sparse in terms of available capacity. The transport crew will keep looking at that in the short term. They'll try and max that out and optimise it COVID safe, of course. And they'll do everything they can in terms of service delivery and other incentives to try and spread that peak as much as possible on public transport. It's a great experience. I think if Mr. Staples was here as the Secretary of Transport, he would say that most people in customer sentiment might be a bit concerned about using public transport until they get on it and realise it's a really, really good experience. And I use bus travel, and it's it's fantastic the way it's been set out. Was concerned about how it actually may be used in terms of stickers on seat and all that type of stuff, but it's actually very, very good. Clearly, it was one of those bizarre times for us to actually go and promote people maybe getting back in their car for a short term. All the things we actually have advocated not to do over many years, but crisis times need sometimes crisis responses in the short term. To your very point, though, for shorter trips, now's the time for walking and cycling to come to the fore. I think your question would be around future transport 2056, how much cycling infrastructure we've probably laid out in there. And correct me if I'm wrong, you'd be looking to have us bring more of that forward.
Yes.
Yeah, that being the case, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but happy to take that one on notice and work out what we've got in terms of the shovel-ready crew and have that conversation with my my good buddies down at Transport about what's actually in the queue, and advocacy from third parties like yourself trying to agitate for some more. Because you are right, what you're saying is correct in terms of we need that first 1 to 3 kilometres walking and cycling, without a doubt. We've promoted it, so it's best we do some stuff to assist with that.
Very good. We'll take you up on that. We were quite thrilled to see West Metro and North South Rail move forward, both as kind of classical public spending for fiscal stimulus reasons, but more importantly, because they set Sydney up for the long run. They're just such important projects. Looking further ahead, do you have can you give us any insights into what might be the next priority after those two in terms of future rail investment for Sydney? Perhaps rail to Newcastle, perhaps some of the other ideas that have been kicking around.
Yeah, so they're all still on the table in terms of Future Transport 2056, and a reminder that faster rail strategy, we've been a little bit distracted, but certainly working away on that all the way through to Christmas last year. So the next steps will be, the enormity of getting West Metro and that first stage of North-South done, but you only have to pull out 2056 document, St Mary's North up to Cudgegong Road, and Aerotropolis and Airport South through to the southwest of Sydney are two obvious next steps for the metro network, and they're not the only ones within that document as well. The faster rail strategy, I think it'll be a good practical and pragmatic approach to intrastate faster rail within New South Wales. When the Premier decides to actually release that with the Transport Minister, I don't know, but they're certainly all still in the infrastructure pipeline. It is one of those things that's a hallmark of this state now. We have far more projects than we have money, and that's as it should be. This place used to have, it would find some money and not have a project off the shelf. It's completely the other way around now. So all of those ones we've been working on over the years are still there, and there'll be more people coming forward with transport projects than there is funding, and long may that continue. That is the way it should be, and there should be a contest for the next best project. So short answer, Future Transport 2056 remains the priorities for the transport cluster, and therefore the largest lifts of the major capital spend for the layout of this state. But I've got to say, I'll repeat, having Metro West and Metro North-South announced now, like they have been, actually getting them in the ground is quite an enormous day for this state.
Yeah, huge progress. Secretary, some questions about transportation demand management, transport demand management, this notion of desynchronizing trips or perhaps simply just convincing people to keep working from home. Some larger scale ideas are floating around, like trying to change retail hours to start later and end later, which might have a benefit for reviving nightlife. Perhaps working with major employers like universities in a more structured way to get them to change their hours in which people would be commuting. Any views on ideas like that?
Yeah, plenty of views. That sounds like a Dorothy Dixer from Rod Staples, but I'm glad it was asked. And if there are transport people online, I apologise for talking about the transport patch, but I love the space. I think we will spend more and more time talking to businesses, major trip generators now than ever before, and we're actually doing that even in the Eastern Harbour City in this central business district. We, as a public sector employer, are a reasonable size employer, but there are a hell of a lot of large corporations we're communicating with as well about how they're changing their ways of working and trying to make that permanent, trying to get the right balance of what permanent looks like. But we are spending more time working with businesses now than we ever have before, having decent conversations with businesses, and not just a short-term change because we're building light rail during a construction period, making it fully permanent. They're really, really fruitful, and it just takes the pressure off the transport people who clearly want to spread the peak, but do not have their hands on the levers of the broader economy. Staggered start and finish times for schools, where the public service itself works from in terms of either coming into very large, tall offices like this one, or more hub locations, or a bit of both, are all up for grabs right at the moment. And a microcosm of that is just what I said about planning being the quiet achiever during this period. Them getting 24-hour deliveries to grocery stores throughout that pandemic period, and doing that overnight almost, was just a small little area where the community probably would have resisted that strongly in the past. But crises create necessary changes, and we need to lock in those benefits. So a lot more focus on that, but a lot more focus from other areas of the government, not just transport trying to run the ball up themselves in terms of having to make all that peak spreading change that they so dearly want. But it's incumbent upon the rest of us to work with businesses, retail and others, take advantage of what's happened with retail going online, and indeed what you've raised, I think, in the past about the tilt towards neighbourhood shopping and how strong that's been to rediscover our local neighbourhoods. It's redefined how transport will work, and we're all in that together, not just the transport cluster itself.
For people lucky enough to be able to work from home effectively, like me, like my whole team, like so many people with office jobs, this has been a pretty easy transition. Many people have really enjoyed getting the time back from commuting. Some employers say that as they survey their employees, there's a big demand to continue working from home. On the other hand, the magic of the city often happens in the CBD. It's where that energy and intensity really happens. It's the center of a modern knowledge economy. How much should we be encouraging people to get back into tall office buildings so that the CBD can surge back, versus how much should we be encouraging people to continue to stay spread out and work from home?
So I suppose it depends on who you ask. The commercial property sector would say, we'd like you all back in there right now. The transport network would like to keep seeing how it can spread the peak, and there are a whole range of other voices in between. But in any direction you look, even my Premier and Cabinet cluster, we're building Sydney Modern, the Australian Museum, we're refurbishing the Sydney Opera House, refurbishing Walsh Bay, Barangaroo Central is being built, and Tech Central down at Central Station is coming out of the ground. All agglomeration hubs. One would imagine that we'll want to see them thriving over the longer term, without a doubt. I think, CBDs will remain those innovation, thought-leading centres that you just described. Absolutely, that's just my view. Others will have different views. But the amount of time we spend in them and the amount of people that might be in them for a period, without a doubt, for the next short-term period, will be volatile. There'll be clearly a lower demand while the public transport network has a capacity constraint on it. That will then ease a little bit further. People will get used to working several days at home, and every business, including us with our 400,000 employees in the public service, are asking their people what they want to do and what works best for them. The results of that will be many and varied, I'm sure. A bit of both, I imagine, will be the right answer. Sometimes at work, sometimes at home. A core element of that will be their commuting time is one of the single biggest benefits that they found. The lack of having that commute time and having productive work, even when they have to look after kids and teach them at home, outweighs the actual commute time sometimes. So I think it'll take a while to emerge, but my feel will be the natural urbanisation that's been going on since World War II will not turn around overnight and become just me in my local neighbourhood. It'll take some will and probably some things for us to think about and do as well, but my belief is that we are social animals. We like to innovate together, we like to be together, and it will bring us back together in pretty significant numbers into CBDs. That's the end of my demography lesson. I have no idea if that's right or wrong, but that's what I think will occur.
Yeah, very good. Secretary, a few questions have come in about climate change. Back in the distant history of January, when we thought the biggest crisis in living memory was the bushfires. Um, there was a lot of thinking going on about climate change. In fact, it was the last pre-COVID conversation you and I were having, was what opportunities there were for New South Wales to go a different direction from the rest of Australia in becoming a climate leader, off of the back of Australia being ranked 61st out of 61 countries for its climate policies. We've seen that the many European countries are using the recovery as a chance to make a phase shift in a more sustainable direction. There's been a lot of speculation about whether the experience in managing COVID might create more space for Australia to change direction. The experience of listening to science and explaining hard issues to the public, and using money to help people negatively impacted, all that could have built some muscle to apply to climate. In your opinion, are there any opportunities to further accelerate action on climate change coming out of this?
I think there are opportunities to do exactly what you said, in terms of there's been very rapid taking of advice from experts on a subject that was and is a crisis called COVID-19. There's been a national cabinet established around a single unity of purpose, and it's been about making sure that we protect our own people in the short term, and then grow and repair and recover our economy. You might insert other subject matter into that instead of COVID. That I suppose my point is the structures are in place to have that conversation. The advocacy will need to continue. I won't jump into the politics of what the Commonwealth are doing, or indeed my own state, except to say, you know, our settings for zero emissions 2050, and a renewables pipeline, and a bilateral between the Commonwealth and the state of New South Wales on climate change and emissions. But the architecture of what's been set up, without being too bureaucratic about it, I have been struck by the speed of decision making when there is a single unity of purpose. The politics has been left at the door, no matter how much politics people still need to think about for their own constituency. It has been left at the door, and there has been a collective will to do things for the national interest, and truly for the national interest. So I suppose all I can leave you with is that architecture and structure is now in place, and there is a strong will to do things together where there is a unity of purpose. The unity of purpose is obviously very, very important in that, though. So it's up to third parties to advocate positions that might use that architecture for what it's set up to do.
All right.
That was my
the opportunities there.
That
It's up
was
to
my
us
best
to
response.
do something with it.
Indeed.
Secretary, your views on National Cabinet. What does it mean for New South Wales to be abandoning COAG and replacing it with National Cabinet?
So the part about abandoning the Council of Australian Governments and the multiple ministerial councils that flood below it and cascade through to lots of steering committees and working groups and working parties, and I could go on. The removal of all of that, for me personally, has meant a great deal of rejoicing. A great deal of rejoicing. It is not an architecture I ever was part of inventing. You fall into it as a senior person in the public service. You head off to another jurisdiction's capital city for an overnight stay, a dinner and a long meeting the next day, and you fly out. You do that about 4 times a year and scratch your head on what you just achieved or didn't achieve. It did move at glacial pace, there is no doubting that, and for me it was past its use by date and past being fit for purpose. Bringing a national cabinet together, for people have lots of commentary about it, but the one thing I've heard in the community is people came together as leaders of this nation and made decisions collectively in the national interest of this country, no matter what their differences were across the various jurisdictions and state and territories. And I've never seen it before. It's been quite a unique, unbelievable experience to watch. It's been a privilege and an honour to actually just be part of that architecture with our Premier of the great state of New South Wales, and to see her lead and advocate both as a New South Welshwoman, but as a key senior member of the Federation for the greater good of this nation. Meeting regularly, meeting at speed, getting to know each other and trusting each other around that table has meant that trust in government across the board has risen through the crisis without a doubt, and that should be bottled again. That should be hung on to. And the Council of Australian Governments and all its ministerial councils, and for all of the public service who have had to service and process so much documentation reporting for those, I will not shed a tear for that going. I can tell you that.
Congratulations. A question about TAFE, which maybe I'll set up by saying that coming out of a recession, there is always a lot of job dislocation. The economy grows back differently. It may be that coming out of this recession, there is an extra large amount of job dislocation. So helping people acquire new skills or evolve their skills is probably a very significant part of the recovery. So we're seeing a lot of focus on skills with JobMaker, and then last week with the Productivity Commission's report on the sector. What do you think needs to happen for vocational education to be as effective as it can be moving forward from here?
So a fair few things, and I could talk about this all day because a few of us are incredibly passionate about vocational education and training and our own government sector, TAFE, in New South Wales, being the largest vocational provider in the country. It will play an enormous role in recovery and retraining, quite literally tens of thousands of people over the next couple of years. And indeed, we just put fee-free courses into the market just a very short while ago from TAFE, and over 100,000 people took up those courses. So the hunger to retrain and to think about doing different things very quickly is there. So we need to capitalise on that. TAFE's day in the sun has been coming for a long time and it hasn't arrived, but we really want it to. We put new leadership into the place and someone out of the transport cluster for that matter. So they'll take a different bent in terms of how they go about things, but a really strong desire to make sure that we have hybrid arrangements and courses with the university sector, finally. Very, very strong connect with industry, but a lot of micro-credentialing and lifelong learning very quickly. So those fee-free courses as a litmus test or a teaser or a taster of what the art of the possible is, and just getting on with things has been really encouraging for me, because what I'd hate to see is us to go into some black box and try and redefine and redesign VET and TAFE over the next 3 years, and the war will come and go. The economic recovery will come and go right next to it. It'll need to be very, very agile about how it puts offerings forward. It'll need to listen to the market very, very carefully and very quickly and respond and partner with the private sector. A real opportunity just to disrupt again now. And as I say, with the leadership in there now, I think he'd be all up for that type of thing. Mr. Forby, he is a very proactive person. I was having conversations with him on this very thing just last Friday. So it will play a massive role, because there are probably several 100,000 people to be trained and retrained. It by its very nature will need to do a lot of that heavy lifting.
Secretary, a question about the police. Following one more killing of an African American at the hands of police in America, in Minneapolis, was the precipitating crisis. First, the United States and then cities all over the world have seen Black Lives Matter protests. In America, those are attached to a fairly well-developed agenda for police reform, reforming the way civilian oversight on police forces works, reforming the way some of those rules and training work. Sydney saw a major protest as well, and it raises the question, does anything need to change in the way policing is overseen in New South Wales?
Sure. I might split that into a few bits. Firstly, I'd like to actually say this. behind the scenes with things like the COVID crisis, bushfires before that, the emergency services, whether they're rural fire services, police, fire and rescue, ambulance, state emergency services, they have enormous jobs to do when it comes to being what they call a lead combat agency. Unusually for a public health crisis where health normally takes the lead, we had police take the lead over the last few months. They pretty much did it pragmatically, just got on with the job. They're required to do that under the state emergency legislation when asked. And they did that, and they've done it magnificently well. They've also undertaken most of the quarantine arrangements in this city where people are coming home. They did that overnight. They've also done a hell of a lot of the procurement of personal protection equipment for the health sector as well. So police have stood up as a lead agency, and they've gone way outside their remit in a spirit of collaboration across the public service. In fact, they work with the public service now more than ever under Commissioner Mick Fuller than they ever have before. I just thought I'd make that clear and acknowledge the work that they do. In terms of last Saturday, split that in two. One is a protest about a unbelievably important social issue, and that reflected with the Aboriginal community in this country. Firstly, though, it was a protest, and the protest raised a whole range of issues around public health orders and whether you should have a protest with a pandemic risk and a risk of a second wave. So on that, that was an issue that played out in the courts as we saw right up until the wire. I think it was about 2:45 p.m. that we finally had a result before the march was considered legal. So I think that's a public health order thing that we need to deal with in terms of protests over the next few months for mass gatherings. To the matter itself, in terms of what the protest was about Black Lives Matter, we have Aboriginal Affairs sitting here in Premier and Cabinet. So clearly the issues raised by the Indigenous community in the state are front and centre for me personally, because I have Aboriginal Affairs with me. And not only that, if you just ask me as a member of the community, I'm deeply passionate about what occurs in terms of the Aboriginal community. I can't control everything though. Most of the things I try to control are about giving the best job opportunities, the best high skill certificate opportunities to the Indigenous population, just like anyone else in the state. I understand, because I grew up in the bush, what life's like for an Indigenous kid a lot of the times. I'll never walk in their shoes, but I've walked beside them many, many times. Giving them economic opportunities, getting jobs, and trying to provide them with learning, education, and through to employment is the best things that I can control. I won't comment on my police colleagues more than I have. I work very, very closely with them. They have a job to do. It's not an easy job. And I equally see that the protest was about a certain issue, and I respect their right to protest, notwithstanding the fact that there was a court case about that protest because of the pandemic. Trust me, over a long, long period of time, and they used to start outside my office a lot of the time, people's right to protest in this state is well respected. They are allowed to, by putting in an application to go and protest, we have to shut down streets to allow them to do so, and quite literally dozens of those things occur year on year. So people's right to protest is well respected.
All right, Secretary, we are at the end of our hour. I want to thank you for everything you are doing to lead New South Wales into a recovery and to make progress on all of these issues. And thank you for making time for us.
Thank you, Gabriel, and thank the Committee for Sydney as usual. Your advocacy is fantastic, as I said at the start, and it is great to see you. My lights have gone out right on cue, so
Perfect timing. Everyone else, thank you for joining, and we'll see you at the next Committee for Sydney Live.
Cheers.